The statement has been on the kitchen table 3 weeks, unopened. That is avoidance wearing the costume of discipline. You wouldn't know what to do with the number anyway. So over the next 20 minutes, 7 money lessons. Where wealth actually comes from over decades, and which part of it is yours. Lesson 5 is the honest objection. The real, documented stretches when patience wasn't rewarded at all. No tips here, no predictions, nothing to buy. If you feel behind, money going somewhere you don't fully understand, a feed full of people who seem to know something you don't, that feeling isn't evidence about you. It's mostly evidence about how loud the room is. By the end, you should be able to name the small number of things that matter and set everything else down. Lesson 1. The slow half of the curve. Take a number and hold it lightly, because this is an illustration and not a promise. Someone puts $500 a month into a broad, diversified portfolio and keeps at it for 40 years. Assume 7% a year. That is near the long-run average for broad American stocks before inflation, a teaching number, not a forecast, and not a promise that any decade will behave. Over those 40 years, they contribute $240,000 of their own money. They finish with about $1,310,000.
Now look at where that ending number actually shows up. At the 20-year mark, halfway through in time, half the money already in, the balance is about $260,000, 20% of the result from 50% of the patients. At year 30, it's about $610,000, which means the final 10 years on their own add something close to $700,000, more than the first 30 years produced put together. That's the shape nobody tells you about. Picture a long, shallow shelf with a cliff at the far end and the cliff facing the right way, which explains something that has probably happened to you or to someone you know. A person saves for 8 years, opens the statement, and finds a number that looks a great deal like the sum of what they put in. They don't conclude that they're impatient. They conclude from perfectly honest evidence that it isn't working, and they stop, out of reasonable judgment applied to the flattest, least convincing part of the whole process. Morgan Housel has made the point that the overwhelming majority of Warren Buffett's net worth arrived after his 65th birthday. His skill is real, but the reason the number became enormous is that he started buying stocks as a boy and never stopped. He gave compounding 80 years, which is the one thing almost nobody gives it.
So in the flat stretch, the correct measure of progress is whether you are still contributing. The balance has nothing useful to say yet, which raises the obvious problem. If the growth arrives that late and you can't hurry it, what exactly are you supposed to do with the intervening decades? There is one lever, and it's the only one with a handle on it. Lesson 2. The part you actually control. Returns are borrowed from the world. You don't set them, negotiate them, or earn them through effort. The savings rate is different. That one you author line by line. 2 people, same $60,000 income, same 30 years. I'll hold the income flat to keep the arithmetic clean. And again, this is illustration. The first saves 10%, $6,000 a year, and earns 7% annually. After 30 years, roughly $567,000. The second saves 20%, $12,000 a year, but earns only 5%, 2 full percentage points worse every single year for 3 decades. After 30 years, roughly $797,000. The worse investor ends with about 40% more money. And the effect runs twice, which is the part people miss. The second person also spent 30 years learning to live on $48,000 a year instead of 54.
So the pile they need in order to stop working is permanently smaller. They're driving a faster car toward a nearer finish line. Sit with the asymmetry. Nobody can raise their returns by deciding to. Almost everybody can raise their savings rate by something, even a little, by deciding to. An hour spent asking for a raise, canceling a subscription you forgot you had, or setting up an automatic transfer is worth more than a month of comparing funds. Which leaves an uncomfortable implication. If better returns aren't really available to you by effort, then most of what you do to a portfolio is simply motion. And motion has a price. Lesson 3. The cost of touching it. In 2000, 2 researchers, Brad Barber and Terence O'Dean, published a study of 66,465 households at a large discount broker, covering 1991 to 1996. The title tells you the finding. Trading is hazardous to your wealth. The fifth of households who traded most actively earned about 11.4% a year after costs. The market over the same stretch returned about 17.9%. They weren't unintelligent people. They were busy people. Then there's the professional version. S&P's SPIVA scorecards have found year after year that over 20-year periods, roughly 9 out of 10 actively managed American large-cap funds fail to beat the plain S&P 500.
Full-time specialists with research staffs losing to a fund whose entire method is to hold everything and do nothing. And the human version. When John Bogle launched the first index fund for ordinary investors on the 31st of August 1976, the underwriting was aiming to raise $150 million. It raised 11.3. Wall Street called it Bogle's folly. The most durable idea in modern investing arrived as a commercial embarrassment because low-cost patience is impossible to sell and very hard to charge for. So the useful habit is to treat every proposed change to your portfolio as guilty until proven innocent. Not forbidden, just made to argue for itself. Ask what it costs you if the reasoning turns out to be wrong, because the fee, the tax, and the timing error are certain, while the benefit is only hoped for. Which brings us to the real question, not whether you know better, why the urge to act arrives at all, and why it always arrives loudest on exactly the worst days. Lesson 4. Why falling feels louder than rising. Your mind is not a neutral instrument for measuring money. In 1979, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published the work on prospect theory that established something now taken for granted. People weigh losses far more heavily than equivalent gains. The ratio is usually estimated at something close to 2 to 1.
A 20% decline does not arrive as the emotional mirror image of a 20% rise. It feels like an emergency. You can see the price of that in the data. Morningstar's annual Mind the Gap studies compare what funds returned with what investors in those funds actually earned. The gap has run somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 percentage points a year, about 1.7 for the decade through 2022, about 1.1 for the decade through 2023. Fees are already inside the fund's own number. What the gap measures is the cost of leaving and coming back. And leaving is expensive for a specific reason. The good days cluster inside the bad periods. In JP Morgan Asset Management's Guide to Retirement illustration, $10,000 in the S&P 500 from the start of 2003 through the end of 2022 grew to about $64,844 if you simply stayed put. If you were absent for only the 10 best days of those 20 years, you ended with about $29,700, less than half the result, from 20 days of absence. 7 of those 10 best days landed within 2 weeks of one of the 10 worst. They stand shoulder to shoulder. Read that as a caution against walking out, never as a reason to rush in. Nobody catches those days on purpose. They land on the people who were already there.
Which is why the rules have to be written in calm weather. Your frightened self at 2 in the morning should not be drafting policy. It should only be following it. Let's stop a moment, because something needs saying. 4 lessons in, everything has pointed the same direction. Stay. Keep buying. Don't touch it. And that is precisely the point where an honest piece has to turn around and ask whether it's actually true, because sometimes it hasn't been. There are documented stretches long enough to swallow an entire working life in which patience was not rewarded. If I skip past those, nothing else here has earned your trust, so we'll slow down for this one. Lesson 5. The decades that don't pay. Japan first. The Nikkei 225 closed at 38,915.87 on the 29th of December, 1989. It did not close above that level again until the 22nd of February, 2024. 34 years. And this was not some obscure corner of the world. At its peak, Japan was something like 40% or more of the entire world's equity market value. A Japanese saver in 1989 was buying the biggest market on Earth. America has its own version. The S&P 500's 2000s were the worst calendar decade in the index's history, with a total return of roughly minus 0.95% a year.
10 full years of contributions and reinvested dividends, ending slightly below where they began. Go back further. In his Fortune essay of November 1999, Buffett pointed out that the Dow finished 1964 at 874.12 and finished 1981 at 875. 17 years, a gain of less than 1 point. Over the same stretch, American GNP nearly quintupled, and individual companies do simply die. General Electric peaked around the summer of 2000 and has never gone back.
Citigroup's pre-crisis high still sits far above its price. Shareholders in Lehman, in Kodak, in Sears were never eventually rewarded for holding on. It always comes back as a statement about markets, and it has never been a statement about companies. So what actually protects a patient investor? 4 things, and none of them is optimism. The first is breadth. In 2018, Hendrik Bessenbinder studied 25,332 American stocks from 1926 to 2016 and found that only about 43% of them beat 1-month Treasury bills over their own lifetimes. Roughly 4% of companies accounted for all of the market's net wealth creation. Everything else, in aggregate, was a wash. So the case for owning everything rests on ignorance rather than confidence. Nobody labels the 4% in advance. The second is geography.
Someone holding a globally diversified portfolio through the 1990s and 2000s was not fully exposed to Japan's drought or to America's lost decade, for the plain reason that those 2 events did not happen at the same time. The third is contributions. A flat decade is a tragedy for a person who has stopped buying. For a saver still adding money every month, it's 10 years of accumulating shares at depressed prices, and the recovery, whenever it comes, arrives on a much larger number of shares. The fourth is the one that gets skipped, and it matters most as you get older. The person genuinely endangered by a bad decade is the one who must sell during it. That's called sequence of returns risk. The same average return delivered in an unlucky order can ruin a retirement that a luckier order would have funded comfortably. It's why William Bengen's 1994 withdrawal rate research exists, and why the bond and cash buffers that grew out of that work exist. Their purpose is to keep someone from being forced to sell into a decline. So hold patience and humility in the same hand. Expect to be unrewarded for stretches long enough to feel permanent. And build something broad enough and a withdrawal plan sober enough that one country's bad 30 years cannot become your whole story. Now suppose it all goes well. Suppose the arithmetic works and the decades cooperate.
There's a version of this story where the money arrives and changes nothing at all because the target moved every time the balance did. Lesson 6. Knowing what enough looks like. Kurt Vonnegut told a story about a party on Shelter Island. He mentioned to his friend Joseph Heller that their host, a hedge fund manager, had made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from Catch-22 in its entire history. Heller said he had something the host would never have: enough. That answer is rare for a reason worth naming. Enough is not a number the world will hand you, because no industry anywhere profits from your satisfaction. Here's what its absence looks like on an ordinary life. A person gets a $15,000 raise. Within about 4 months, it's gone, absorbed into a slightly better car payment, a slightly better apartment, 2 or 3 subscriptions, nothing extravagant, nothing they'd call a mistake if you ask them, and their savings rate is exactly what it was. 10 years and 3 raises later, they earn far more money and stand precisely as far from freedom as they did before, because the finish line moved every time they did. Wealth is a ratio, and the denominator is your appetite. That's the part of the equation nobody sells you a product for.
It's also the temperament that made Buffett and Charlie Munger unusual, and it's the least imitated thing about them. What they wanted stopped growing long before their money did. So write it down. In actual numbers, what a satisfying life costs you: housing, food, the things you genuinely miss. Then let future raises flow into the gap between that figure and your income, rather than into the figure itself. And once the number is written, this whole thing collapses into something almost disappointingly small. Lesson 7. The Ordinary Tuesday. Ronald Reed spent much of his working life pumping gas, and then working as a janitor at a J.C. Penney in Brattleboro, Vermont. When he died in June of 2014 at 92, his estate was worth roughly $8 million. Several million went to his local hospital and library. He had no unusual income. He had no inside knowledge of anything. He bought sound, diversified, dividend-paying holdings, lived far below his means, and left them alone for decades, reportedly keeping the certificates in a safe deposit box. The point is that his entire method fits inside one sentence and required no cleverness at all, only decades of not interrupting. An orchard planted this spring produces nothing worth harvesting for years.
And the grower who digs a tree up each March to inspect the roots will always have an explanation for why nothing is growing.
So the remedy lives in the plumbing rather than in your resolve. Automate the contribution so that it doesn't require a decision on any given morning. Choose an allocation you could genuinely tolerate seeing down 40%, because someday you will. And then put your attention where the returns are actually good: your career, your health, the people who will still be there in 30 years. If there's one worn phrase this whole piece has earned, it's that time in the market has done more for ordinary savers than timing it ever has. And the reason is unglamorous. Time asks less of you. Design it so that doing nothing is the default and action takes effort. Then let a boring system carry you through the decades your willpower was never going to survive. So, 7 lessons. You won't remember all of them, and you don't need to. If one loosens something, the flat years are supposed to be flat. The savings rate is the lever with a handle on it. You're allowed to define enough and then stop moving it. That's the one to keep. Notice something about the whole list. Not one of those 7 required you to be right about anything. Not about a company, not about a year, not about what happens next.
Only to keep showing up, own broadly, cost little, and give the arithmetic the time to do the part you can't do yourself. Which brings us back to the kitchen table and that unopened statement. Go and open it. Not because the number will tell you anything useful this week. It almost certainly won't, especially if you're standing on the shallow part of the shelf. Open it because avoidance is the one habit that quietly ends the whole thing, and because you now know what you're looking at. A flat stretch is not a verdict. A frightening month is not an instruction. And the only question that statement can honestly answer is the one that has mattered all along. Are you still contributing? The market will be loud again next week. Your job on that day is much smaller than it feels. If this is the kind of company you'd like on the quiet days, subscribing is the easiest way to keep it coming. We take these ideas slowly here, one at a time. And if one of the 7 landed for you, leave a comment and tell me which one and why. It's a genuinely useful thing for someone else to read. Until next time, take your time.